Hello everybody, this is Matthew Janner for Card Runners, and since the end of the world did not happen, I'm here with Analyzing Turn Board Textures 12-22-12. So we're finally going to emphasize turn analysis, because I always say we're going to analyze board textures and then I just never get past the flop. We're doing it this time. So, we of course need to first analyze the flop texture before we can move on to the turn, but right afterwards I'm just going to randomly generate a turn card with either Flopzilla or another program. We'll assume ranges are cutoff versus button. Just about every concept we discuss now will apply for other positions too, with button versus blind play being a bit trickier. But it's still much of the same, it's just a little bit trickier when you have someone flat from the blinds. Note my setup, it's pretty useful for analyzing hands, and then we're just going to jump right in right now. Alright, so here's my setup. I got PokerStove, Flopzilla, and then a Word document to take notes on if we want. Here is the cutoff opening range we're going to use. You can go ahead and freeze the screen if you want and study this for a minute, but there's really no reason to. It's a very standard cutoff open. There's nothing really special about it. And here's my cutoff versus button flat. Same deal. Really nothing very special about it. I don't feel very passionately about the weaker hands in this range calling them. If you want to 3-bet them or fold a lot of hands in this range, that's fine. Although I wouldn't really recommend 3-betting the pocket pairs. And then I'm calling with 25% of my aces and ace-king off. That gives me a little bit of protection against squeezes, and it lets you do some nice things on king-high boards. Again, I've talked about that in other videos. We won't spend too much time here. So, here are the ranges. We're going to go ahead and jump right in. So let's make a random flop. Alright, aces of spades, queen of spades, four hearts. And as I discussed in my previous videos, the way I like to start with analyzing a board texture, there's many ways to do it, is I kind of like to start thinking how valuable is position. So on this board texture, I don't think position's all that incredibly valuable. Of course, position's still quite good, but it's not all that incredibly valuable because it's pretty easy to check a call when you're out of position here. It's actually about as easy to check a call on this board texture as I really think they come, because if you look at the cutoff opening range, there's just a lot of top pairs or betters that we can even do middle pair. There's a lot of middle pair or better that can very comfortably be check called here when you're out of position. Whereas when you're in position, whereas on other board textures, it's much more difficult to check a call. Here, since there's a lot of high cards, it's pretty easy to check a call. The other thing you want to do is, and this is going to matter less for cutoff versus button ranges, is you can take each range, you can plug it into PokerStove, and then you plug in the board texture and you get a sense for how much equity each range has. So as of right now, the two ranges that we're using, actually, let me take off the ace, king, and aces. So you want to be careful if you're using like only a certain amount of ace, king, and aces that you add in the right amount. So I'm just going to do that right now. We'll leave in two aces. So right now, before we see a flop, the cutoff opening range and the button flatting range have almost exactly 50% equity each. So then we plug in the flop texture to see if the equity sort of changed. Did one range get more equity? And just because one range got more equity does not necessarily mean that board texture favored that range, but it usually does. So not all equity is created equally. So sometimes a range can actually get more equity on a certain board texture, although the board texture didn't hit that range all that well. Because remember, you want a lot of nutted hands more than you want a lot of marginal hands. Even though if you have a whole bunch of marginal hands, it will give you a lot of equity. So here, the equity went up a little bit for the cutoff. So I guess the ace high board with the queen just favored the cutoff opening range a little bit at a glance, which is fine. Okay, so let's start talking about what we're going to kind of do here when we're out of position. So out of position, if we bet all three streets, I don't think the button will need to call down with worse than ace-jack. Even ace-jack might be limited to some combos. Because if we look at the cutoff versus button flat, if we were to go 75% pot size bet on all three streets, so this is the top 24% of his range. If we were to make a 75% pot size bet on all three streets, you usually don't see a player who faces a 75% pot size bet 3 times call down with worse than the top 25% of his flopping range. Sometimes it's even a lot less than that. So right here, if someone goes bet, 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 and we're in position, we're not usually going to end up calling down with hands like ace-10, ace-9, and ace-8, because we're just going to be able to fold them by the river in order for our opponent to really have any incentive to bluff. So here, it's going to be really hard for the cutoff to even value bet ace-jack effectively, because even with ace-jack, at best it's kind of going to split if ace-jack goes bet, 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 and the opponent calls down, whereas in reality it's probably going to mostly lose. And you also want to think the player in position here actually has a lot of really premium hands. 8.33% 2-pair, so it makes all those ace-queen off combos. And then the cutoff open only has 2-pair 7%. So here, when we're betting out of position, most people recklessly bet pretty much all the time with the pre-flop raiser, especially at low stakes. Here I don't even really like value betting ace-jack. I think you can probably value bet ace-king. My mind would not be blown even if ace-king's not a value bet. And when I say ace-king's not a value bet on the flop, I don't mean it's not a profitable bet. I just mean it's possible that ace-king has a higher EV as a check, because this is the board texture where you really need to bet ace-king on the flop for protection. You're not afraid of giving free cards, and it sucks when you bet ace-king and get raised. So when we're out of position here with ace-king, we're kind of asking ourselves, okay, is it better that we bet ace-king on the flop? That way if we go bet, we'll get value from, are we getting enough value from ace-jack to justify betting on the flop? Because what sucks is when we bet ace-king and get raised, our hand instantly becomes a bluff catcher. Because honestly, our opponent's probably value raising on this board with ace-queen, pocket fours, and that's it. And that's still a lot of combos, because as I've talked about in other theory series, if someone's raising 3 combos of pocket fours on this flop and 9 combos of ace-queen, obviously we'll discount that if we have ace-king, but still 9 combos of ace-queen, that's 12 value raises, not counting draws, and then they're going to be able to bluff raise a ton of combos. So even ace-king on this board, if I could go back in time and talk to myself in the past, I'd think anyone that told me to check ace-king in the cutoff is crazy. It doesn't sound that crazy to me to check ace-king here. It's just a hard spot to value bet all 3 streets. I don't mind betting it at all, and I would probably bet it against weaker opponents, but it's probably not as crazy as it sounds to check with ace-king on this flop. It's going to be decently hard to get 3 sheets of value. This board just hits both ranges pretty well. Okay, so what hands are you going to check call with if you're in the cutoff? Pretty obvious, right? Let's just say we bet ace-king, so you're going to check call with like ace-jack, ace-10. Pretty much you're going to check call with most of the suited aces, or I should say you're going to check call with most of the aces that are ace-jack and weaker. It's okay to also bet some hands for 1 street of value to put some check calling hands in your range on the turn. So what I mean by that is there's nothing really wrong here with betting like, let's just say ace-3 of hearts. Maybe you want to bet ace-3 of hearts and then check call it on the turn to get some value against your opponent when he floats you with gut shots. It's okay to do some kind of stuff like that to balance out your range, and that's when you start getting more technical. Like, the way I usually do this is I start out with all the obvious hands. I put the obvious hands in the obvious ranges. And then afterwards you start thinking, okay, how can we exploit that? So here, if we never bet any weak aces, it might be that our opponent can too easily sort of float us on the flop, and then when we check the turn, we're always check folding. But we still don't want to bet aces very often on this flop, because betting weak aces really doesn't accomplish a whole lot, I don't think. Because we don't really make, yeah, we'll get a little bit more value from queen, so that does accomplish something, but we open ourselves to being raised by ace-queen and, pocket fours and bluffs. And also, even though we get value if we bet ace-3 here against a queen, we're going to get that value on a later street. So, again, whenever you do this stuff, I always, pretty much in videos, do stuff at a glance. You're probably going to want to check most of your aces and queens here, but it can make sense to bet some and then even check call them or check raise them on the turn. Probably check call them with the ace. Okay, so when you're out of position here, check call with some draws, check call with some aces, check call with some queens. Mostly check call your marginal strength hands, which is pretty obvious. Make sure you balance that with some draws. Yeah, and then if you're going to bet 3 streets, ace, queen, pocket fours, pocket queens, pocket aces, if they're not check raised on the flop. Okay, so let's look at the cutoff versus button flat. So if you're facing a bet on the flop here, what you're probably going to want to do is, as I already mentioned, raise ace, queen, pocket fours, and a whole bunch of air. Then you're just going to call with all the next best hands. Position's always much easier to play when you're in position. So pretty much call with all your aces, call with all your queens. You don't even have bad queens here. All this stuff has really been discussed in detail in other videos, so I don't imagine people have much trouble knowing how to sort of play here. You can raise your gut shots. Let's see, how many gut shots do you have here? Okay. Oh, that's not what we want. Okay, so we don't have as many gut shots here as we'd probably like. You could raise some and call with some. You can even raise, you can raise some flush draws and call with some. Don't be afraid to raise flush draws just because you don't have like overcards here. It's fine to raise some flush draws as well. And then if we don't really find we have a lot of, awesome bluff randomizers, well, one thing we can also do is, we can easily raise 6-5 of hearts. We can raise 6-7 of hearts. Maybe even raising pocket 3s or pocket 2s with a spade is good. Because sometimes you really have to force out those randomizers. Like right here, and I could just be drawing blanks. So let's go over what look like the sort of best bluff raise randomizers here. So I'm going to say some gut shots. We had 9 of those that were possible that aren't also flush draws. 6-5 of hearts is going to be good. 6-7 of hearts is going to be good. Then we're also going to have how many bottom pairs? So 6-5 suited and 5-4 suited. So that's another 6 combos. So if assuming you flat with some of your gut shots, you're probably going to want to raise like 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited if you don't flat with them. This 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight I already mentioned. And then you're also going to want to probably raise some pocket 3s and pocket 2s with a spade. Because Pocket threes and pocket twos with a spade. They can still run a runner a weak flush and win. They can run a runner a very, very tricky straight. And sometimes they're just going to binker, they're just going to turn a river the set, which is also nice. That happens about 10% of the time. So those aren't ideal, but if we don't really have better stuff to raise with, that can be fine here. Okay, so that's kind of the flop at a glance. So now I'm going to randomly generate the turn. But before I do, I really want to emphasize this. Most of the time when you're doing stuff, whether it's theory, exploitative, whatever, you're really usually taking obvious lines with obvious hands. And then as you see that really obvious strategy, you start to realize, oh, wait a second, if someone plays that way, I can exploit them. So going back to the cutoff open, because I don't think I've discussed this a lot in other videos. So going back to the cutoff open right here, it's weird that people just automatically c-bet with ace X suited here. Like, when you really think about it, most people, if we post this hand on 2+2, no one's probably going to make a comment, I think, if we c-bet like ace 10 off here, or ace 5 of diamonds. But even though that sounds like, okay, we're just taking the obvious line with the obvious hands, that's really not that obvious. Like, the ranges both look comparable. Position's still going to be an advantage, right? And the person in position has the more premium hands here. He has more two-pair combos. So why are we betting with a hand that's not really vulnerable and it's not really strong? It's just kind of a habit people have developed. So when I say take the obvious line with the obvious hands, I don't mean just do what everyone else is doing, because a lot of that stuff doesn't make sense. But what I do mean is, after you kind of have thought, okay, does it make sense to bet this? Does it make sense to check this? You've done what seems sort of easy and obvious if you understand theory kind of well, and you're not just automatically c-betting or automatically checking. You'll probably notice there's a bit of a problem with the range, which is like, okay, my opponent can exploit me if I always do that. So here, it's likely that we would find in theory, if we never bet any marginal strength hands here, like if we never bet any marginal queens or marginal aces, then it might be really difficult for us to check call on the turn, and that might cause us problems. I know I'm saying a lot of might because we can't convert equity into expected value, so it's hard to tell what to do. But that might cause us problems as we started playing around with this. So just be aware of that. We're kind of doing the sort of the obvious stuff, as I've already mentioned, but if you're getting really technical, you're going to have to do a lot of the little fancy stuff, but the little fancy stuff's usually not that important. So yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and randomly generate the turn. Lock the flop, and then the turn's a 4 of diamonds. Okay, so if we bet on this flop and we're out of position on the turn, is our range still polarized? So think about what happened. We bet the flop, our opponent called, the turn card came to 4 of diamonds. Is our range still polarized? Yes. Very, very polarized. In fact, it's really unlikely our opponent would slow play pocket 4s on the flop. Maybe he'd slow play ace queen, but probably he'd still raise that. So on the turn, if we bet with ace queen or a set, we probably can consider ourselves pretty much nutted. It's not likely we're beat at all. Maybe our opponent didn't raise us on the flop if he had 4x and we now lose to that, but even then, on the flop, half of the remaining 4x are going to be 4-5 suited or 6-4 suited with the spades, so those probably get raised on the flop. So for the most part, if we bet the flop in the cutoff's shoes here, and our opponent called and we got this turn, our range is still super, super polarized. We're mostly going to bet. And then if we do check, we're probably not going to check call all that often. Because if we bet this, if we bet the flop and our range is polarized, on the turn, we're still going to have that polarized range. We don't have that many hands that want to check a call. Going back, as I said, maybe we did bet a few ace-x suited, but for the most part, we don't have that many hands that want to check call here. So when we do check the turn, we're mostly going to be check folding, and then when we do bet, we're going to be betting with a very, very polarized range that has a lot of really strong hands and bluffs that retain their equity pretty well. So if our opponent called us on the flop and he has, so let's say the button called us on the flop with king-queen, he's definitely rooting for us to check the turn, because if we check the turn, he's probably going to win with his king-queen. But if we bet, he's going to have a bluff catcher, and we're probably going to be betting pretty big, because our opponent's going to have a lot of medium strength hands relative to our range here. If we're in position and facing a bet, as I just mentioned, this is a spot where if we called on the flop, we probably have like an ace-jack or an ace-10 or a draw that didn't get there. So when our opponent is on the turn here, we're going to be saying, please check, please check, please check, please check, please check, when we hold ace-jack or ace-10. That's how the math behind the spot would work. Because we know, okay, our range is mostly the bluff-catching range, whereas our opponent's range is mostly the, polarized range. But even though our opponent's range is polarized, he can't always bet the turn. Because if our opponent always bets the turn here and we have ace-jack or ace-10, we can just super easily snap call him and say to ourselves, well, it's exploitative to call him because our opponent is, he's betting recklessly. He's always betting the turn and he doesn't have that many value hands. So if we're in position on the turn, we're really rooting for our opponent to check, because once he does, we know we're probably going to win because our opponent's pretty much check folding. And then when he does bet, if he's balanced, we go, ugh, that sucks, because, now we're indifferent to calling or folding with pretty much all of our bluff catchers. It doesn't really matter if we have ace-10 or king-queen on the turn, or ace-10 or even queen-10. The hand strength is just very, very similar, relative to our opponent's range. Okay, so this one was really easy. We can randomly generate, let's just stick with the turn today. So let's just randomly generate another one. Okay. Alright, so Jack 5-2. So if you want, pause this for a second and, sort of think what I'm going to say. But remember, I usually start out saying how valuable is position. Another useful way to start out is we could just type in the board texture right here. Jack of spades, 5 of diamonds, 2 of spades. If I ever meet the guy that made Poker Stove, I owe him a beer because this is an awesome free program. Alright, right here we see that the cutoff opening range has a little bit less equity. So before it had 52% equity on the previous board texture. Now it has 49% equity. So, okay. It has a little bit less equity. Let's not look too into that, and it wasn't that big of a change. How easy is it to check a call here? So this is one where you're probably going to get more of a debate, and since you can't convert equity into expected value, this stuff can get very complicated. But, how tough is it to check calls the cutoff here? So how valuable is position? Personally, I don't think it's that hard to check a call. Because if we look at our top pair hands, a lot of them are going to have an overcard, which is nice, because if we have an overcard, then there's only 8 outs for our opponent, or 8 overcards on the turn that are bad for us. Whereas if we don't have an overcard, there's 12. So it's not that hard to check a call here with like King Jack or Queen Jack. So I don't think position's of course valuable here, and it's probably more valuable here than it was in the last spot, I believe. But it's still a board that I think is very reasonable to play out of position. In reality, people recklessly c-bet as the preflop raiser. They don't balance their checking range here. All that kind of jazz. But yeah, this one shouldn't be that bad. So let's start out with the obvious stuff. The obvious stuff here, I think, is if you're out of position here, you need to check raise pocket 5s and pocket 2s. Because you're not going to be able to recklessly bet here. Why can't you recklessly bet here? Well, you have, first of all, you're out of position in the cutoff. Second of all, you have less equity than he does. It's about the same. Let's look at how the equity is distributed, though. So here you have overpair 8.6% or set 3%. Let's look at the cutoff for split and flat. You do have less overpairs here, but you have more sets. So how the equity is distributed is a little bit more difficult to quickly assess, but it's probably comparable. And you combine the fact that, okay, so the equity is distributed the comparable way. Both ranges have about the same amount of equity, but one person has position, which is a huge deal. Well, in that case, the cutoff really shouldn't be recklessly betting. And how do you protect your checks? Well, check calling is not super difficult here, but it's still not, fun. So you're going to want to protect a lot of your checks by check raising. And the way you do that, check raise pocket 5s, check raise pocket 2s if you want, and then obviously add in a ton of bluffs. If you wanted to add in some draws too, that would of course be good. You should have those in your range. And then you of course also need to add in a bunch of bluffs. So what kind of hands, here's a good one. What kind of hands make good check raise bluffs here? And again, I don't have the answer for this. This isn't something you can solve for, but okay, so what kind of hands make the perfect check raises? Well, the perfect check raise bluff for me, I would want to be able to win at showdown if my opponent checks back. I would want the hand to retain its equity very well. That's probably the most important one. So basically those two. I would want it to retain its equity well, and then another thing which would also be nice is I'd like it to hit on cards that I still get paid. So here, the kind of hands that I think will work pretty well as a check raise bluff are going to be the same hands that c-bet well as a bluff. Because usually if your hand retains its equity well as a c-bet, it will also retain its equity well as a check raise. So, alright, so what kind of hand could we check raise with here? I think a 5x hand would be very good. So let's look at what 5x's we have. So we have 7-5 suited, 6-5 suited, and 5-4 suited. All those look like fine check raises to me. I don't have a problem with any of those. They have some showdown value if he checks back, I guess. And if we hit a 7 or a 5 or a 6 or a 4 on the turn and make 2 pair trips, we're going to pretty much get paid. So other hands that work well as check raise bluffs are going to be the same kind of hands you can c-bet bluff with. So you can have 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight type of deals. But yeah, I think the 5s are kind of going to be the ones that make the best check raise bluffs. So those are 9 combos right here. If we're only check raising the sets for value, we'll probably need a few more than 9 bluffs. Maybe we'll need 1 or 2 more. So the last bluff you use can, be 3 to a flush or 3 to a straight or something like that. Another thing that's interesting to note on this board is when you're trying to check a call. This was something I don't think I ever realized when I was actually playing, which is check calling a hand like ace-king on this board actually probably is awesome. I shouldn't say actually probably is. Yeah, I'll say actually probably is awesome. because I do want to still say probably because it's not something you can prove. So, ace-king. If I bet this on the flop, and I always would bet ace-king on the flop here because it's profitable because people told me to do it. But think about it. When I bet ace-king on the flop, what kind of hands am I making fold? Well, I'm probably making my opponent fold like ace-10 and ace-9, and probably not king-queen. Maybe king-10s or queen-10s. It depends. Queen-10 actually wouldn't be a problem. But what I'm getting at is, if I bet, ace-king on this board, I might make my opponent fold some ace-x or king-x hands that I kind of didn't really want to make fold. Because, let's just stick with ace-10. If I bet ace-king on this flop, and my opponent has ace-10 and I make him fold, I kind of made him fold a hand that had tainted outs. Because if I would have checked called the flop and my opponent bluffed with an ace-10, he'd probably keep value betting an ace on the turn. So if I check call ace-king and my opponent has ace-10, he bets, I call. Because remember, ace-king has probably 6 outs on the turn and a bunch of showdown value. So ace-king is a pretty good check call from that alone. But on top of that, the kind of hands my opponent's going to bluff with a lot on this flop are going to be hands that have tainted outs. This is more so exploitatively than theoretically, I think, because exploitatively, if someone checks to you and you have ace-10 here and you're in the button, I'm guessing over 90% of the people that watch this video are just insta-betting it. And honestly, it's probably best to just insta-bet it against the vast majority of opponents. But if I check call ace-king, it gives me a chance to sort of hit that ace or the king against my opponent's weaker ace or king, and that's awesome. So ace-king and stuff can be check called here, and then as you get to more, to less obvious examples, so now if I just said check calling ace-king is good, then someone might say, well, what about ace-queen? Okay, I mean, yeah, ace-queen's probably okay to check call too, and you might want to bet some as well. Because you also are going to want to hit, on some ace and king and queen high boards on the turn. So both are fine, but I definitely think check calling ace-king here in the cutoff is much, 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 much better than I would have thought before, and most people probably think right now. And you probably need to be doing it to balance your checking range. Again, if you were the cold caller, you'd have no problem check calling with I want to say the nutted overcards. So if you were the cold caller, you'd have no problem check calling with the nutted overcards. But since you're the pre-flop raiser, you probably think there's some reason you should be betting, even if that's not the case. Even if you're out of position with less equity and not really that much better of a distribution of equity. Okay, so let's do in position now. So in position is kind of easy. Like if you face 3 barrels, you're probably going to end up having to call down with top pair or better. You're not even going to need to call down with Jack 9 or even probably Queen Jack here, because when we say that make up the top 20% of the range, but I'm not going to only defend by calling. I'm also going to defend by raising, and when I choose to defend by raising, I'm going to end up having to use bluffs. So, let's say I face 3 bets when I'm in position, and let's just assume I have to defend 20% of my range. I'm not going to defend 20% of my range by calling, which would only make me call down with Jack 9 suited if the turn and the river were complete blanks and if I never raised. So since I am going to defend by raising, and since the turn and the river aren't going to be complete blanks, there's almost no way I end up felting Jack 9 or Queen Jack suited here. And by felting, I don't mean getting all in, I mean going call, call, call against 3 bets. So keep that in mind. You're probably going to end up either, you're probably going to end up folding Queen Jack or Queen Jack or Jack 9 by the river if you face 3 bets. Maybe you would turn it into a bluff raise somewhere, but you're probably not. You're probably going to end up folding it. And that's important to remember when you're debating whether or not to bet out of position. Because if you're out of position and your opponent's not going to call down with, Queen Jack or Jack 10, maybe you don't want to bet the flop. Maybe you want to check call instead and protect your checking range. Okay, so yeah, if you face 3 bets here, you're going to raise pocket 5s and pocket 2s either on the flop or the turn, and then you're going to randomize that with some bluffs. What kind of bluffs work well? The same deal. I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record for the next however many videos I make for card runners. But yeah, it's the same deal. 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight. The weak pairs that aren't going to be tainted. So, I mean, the weak pairs that aren't going to be tainted, I mean, if you're raising here with 6-5 or 5-4 suited, the 5 and the 6 does not set off any alarm bells with your opponent. If you're bluff raising better pairs, and you wouldn't want to, you wouldn't bluff raise Queen Jack here or anything, but what I'm getting at is you don't want to raise with hands that are going to not play as well when you improve. So, if you were to bluff with sort of a hand that kind of isn't going to get you paid very well, that's not usually going to be a good idea. That's not going to really be that big of a risk in practice in most spots if you're playing well. And, yeah, so just the 5s are going to make the best bluff raises here anyways. So bluff raise is 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited, the 7-6, 8-7, 9-8, 10-9 of diamonds. All those hands seem like good bluff raises. They retain their equity very well, and they actually double barrel very well too, which is really important. Float with the hands that retain their equity against your opponent's bluffs. another thing I have not emphasized enough in previous videos. I just talked about how check calling ace-king is awesome. Raising ace-queen off here with a spade, I think, is not good. And that's something that I used to do before I understood this stuff, because you think, oh, ace-queen with the ace of spades, that can work as a profitable raise. But I don't want to raise ace-queen with the ace of spades because I make my opponent fold the hands that I beat. So ace-queen, I want to call because if my opponent's bluffing with ace-10, I can turn an ace, and that's awesome. I want to call because if my opponent's bluffing with queen-10 of diamonds, I can turn a queen, and that's awesome. I don't want to raise with ace-queen and make my opponent fold queen-10 or ace-10 and all that kind of stuff. I want to raise with 8-9 of diamonds and then make my opponent fold ace-10. So think about not only how your hand retains equity against your opponent's value bets, also think about how your hand retains equity against your opponent's bluffs. Can you keep in bluffs that will have like a tainted out against your range? If you can, that's good. You didn't want to do that. So yeah, so call with ace-king, call with ace-queen. And yeah, like king-queen and stuff too would probably work well as calls. Okay, so yeah, in position stuff, right? It's pretty easy. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers it, so I'm going to lock the board and make the turn. Lock and flop. Random. Okay, so 6 of clubs. Did this turn card change the strength of either player's range much? Probably not, right? Like, yeah, some bluffs might have gotten there from the cutoff betting range. So, for example, the cutoff might have bet pocket sixes with a spade on the flop, and now it got there. Maybe he bet the cutoff bet 6-5 suited rather than check raised it. It got there. But for the most part, this would be considered a dry-ish turn on sort of a medium wettish board on the flop. So this flop, I would consider this flop on the dry side, but it's not like, you know, there are still flush draws. When the turn card gets there, it's a blank. So if it's a blank, more or less, whoever bet the flop still has a polarized range, so they should be the one that keeps mostly betting. So here, if the cutoff bet and the button called, I expect the cutoff to mostly be the better. And when the cutoff does check, I expect the cutoff to also be check folding a lot. That doesn't mean the cutoff never bet the flop with a hand that wants to bet one street of value and check call the turn. The cutoff could have easily done that with pocket 8s or pocket 9s here. The cutoff could have been like, hey, I have pocket 9s, I'm going to bet the flop to make high equity hands fold, and then when the turn card comes to 6, then the guy check calls pocket 9s. That's fine, but for the most part, the better has a polarized range. We expect him to mostly be doing the betting, and if he's out of position, he'll be check calling sometimes, but, you know, probably not check calling as much as you expect him to be betting. If the person in position bet the flop, so let's say the cutoff checked and the button bet, it's going to be very similar, where we're going to expect the cutoff to always check on the flop. He'll never have a donk betting range here. And then the button we expect to usually be betting, and when the button checks back, it probably is going to, or he's probably going to be giving up on the river. You know, again, maybe the button bet the flop with pocket 9s or pocket 8s, and he's going to check back on this turn and then plan on calling a river bet. That's definitely possible, definitely a reasonable line. But for the most part, if the button bet on the flop, he has the polarized range. He's expecting the cutoff who check called to mostly have what I would call a condensed range of mostly medium strength hands. So we expect the button to usually be betting. In fact, if anyone bets on the turn after the cutoff check called the flop, it will always be the button. The cutoff will never donk bet. So if the button bets, you know, maybe the cutoff will check raise sometimes, but he'll mostly defend by check calling. And then if the button checks back, we'll mostly expect the button just has a crap hand. Cool. So one thing to notice is both the last two board textures had what we would call like a blank turn. When it's a blank turn, it's not that surprising. You expect the opponent to usually just not have a very strong, or you expect the caller to not have many very strong hands in his range, and you expect the flop better to have the polarized range and usually be betting. But he's not always going to bet because he needs some of the bluffs in his range to drop out. Otherwise, he'll have too many bluffs in his betting range. So, as I've talked about in other videos, you usually want to have a whole ton of bluffs on the flop for only a few value bets. On the turn, you want a closer amount of value bets and bluffs, like around a 1-to-1. And then on the river, you want to have a lot more value bets than bluffs because you're giving your opponent a great price. So always keep that in mind. You can have a whole ton of bluffs in your betting range on the flop, around 1-to-1 value bet to bluffs on the turn, and then you need a lot more value bet than bluffs on the river. Okay, so let's just keep going. Another thing you're probably noticing is I'm spending a lot more time talking about the flop than the turn, and that's partly been because we've gotten pretty dry turns, which are usually the easier ones to talk about. But a lot of it is also just, if you're playing the flop well, I think the turn's a lot easier to play than the flop. Because on the flop, that's when you have to deal with a whole ton of combos and balance a whole ton of ranges. Whereas on the turn, it's kind of just like, I either called on the flop and then my range is mostly condensed and I kind of know my role, or I bet on the flop and my range is polarized and I mostly know my role. So the turn's actually kind of easier to, or a lot easier, I should say, to play, I think, than the flop if you play the flop well. It's just most people don't play the flop well. Most people play the flop very, very poorly. And then since they play the flop poorly, they end up having all these hands in their turn range that don't belong, and then they're not balanced. They're like, oh, what do I do with this hand that shouldn't even be here? And that's why they think the turn is the hardest street to play in poker. So I'm going to kind of do an impression, not to put anyone down, but I think a lot of people are kind of like, okay, I'm going to bet the flop and hope my opponent folds. And then if he folds, I'm just going to move on with my life. I'm never going to think about the hand again. But then if he calls, then I'm just going to be lost on the turn for a bigger pot and not know what to do. That's usually not the best way to approach the hand. Sometimes it is okay to just bet and be like, dude, I don't know what I'm going to do on a later street, but I think betting here is best. But for the most part, if you find you're going to be lost on a later street, there's a lot of times going to be able to, a lot of times you could avoid that if you took a better line earlier. Sometimes you're just going to get a tricky turn or river, and you're not going to be able to get away from that. But for the most part, if you play the flop well, the turn's going to be pretty easy, which is probably why we're just not spending that long on it. Okay, random time. Alright, so ace 3-3. This is like the driest board I've ever seen in my life. So, let's plug it in. Clear. Ace of spades. 3 of clubs, 3 diamonds. Even getting the suits for the nits at home. Again, almost exactly 50-50%. That's very common when you have these ranges. How big of a deal is position here? It's not really that big a deal. Yeah, position's always nice, but it's like, It's going to be like whoever bet the flop has the polarized range, whoever called has a condensed range. It's so easy to know what each player's role is on the turn of the river. If I check called against you on the flop, your job is to bet the turn. I'm not going to donk bet the turn, or I'm not going to, ever. If I bet the flop, then I have the polarized range. It's my job to be the better. It doesn't really make that much sense to bet a hand for one or two streets of value here when you're out of position. Like, think about it. What hands do you want to go bet, check, call with on this board? What hands do you want to go bet, check, call with? So bet the flop and check call with on the turn. My guess is none. Or very close to none, if not literally none. Now, technically, I'm sure the theoretical solution would be all wonderfully complex and stuff. But for the most part, it just doesn't, it doesn't make sense to bet here for 1 or 2 streets of value, because the reason why you usually bet for 1 or 2 streets of value when you're out of position is to make high equity hands fold. That's usually the reason why you're going to, bet on the flop. You're going to bet on the flop saying, okay, I'm betting here with a hand that can't bet multiple streets, so I'm making the pot bigger, I'm making my opponent's range stronger, and I'm risking getting raised, but I'm cool with it because I want to make my opponent fold some high equity hands. Here, I just don't get that feeling. I don't feel like, what am I trying to bet for 1 or 2 streets and make? There's nothing. Right. So on this flop, let's click on the cutoff opening range. So let's start off saying if we bet all 3 streets, actually we'll start here. If we bet all 3 streets from the cutoff, our opponent's pretty much going to have to call with top pair or better, and he's not really going to raise here. So this is actually probably pretty accurate. If we bet 75% of the pot on all 3 streets, more or less this is what the opponent's going to call down with. Maybe he raises his ace-king, and obviously he'll raise his pocket 3s. So he'll raise ace-king and pocket 3s, which will let him bluff a few more combos. But for the most part, you probably expect your opponent to call down with ace-10 here if you bet all 3 streets. That seems about right. So when you're out of position in the cutoff, it doesn't really make sense, I don't think, to bet the flop with a hand that's much worse than ace-jack. And even ace-jack might want to check a call because you're still going to be value betting yourself a lot when you bet ace-jack here, even though you probably do beat ace-10 on the river. So, it's hard to tell exactly what you should do when you have ace-jack in the cutoff shoes, but I would think you probably want to, you're going to have to check call a lot of hands here. So you're going to check call. Let's look. So you have a lot of top pairs and stuff that are going to check call, and you're going to be check calling a lot of your middle pairs. The middle pairs would actually be a reasonable hand to bet 1 or 2 streets for value. So if you wanted to bet pocket 10s or pocket 9s on the flop, maybe you make your opponent fold king jack, maybe you make him fold king 10, and that might be pretty good. So you could bet some hands for 1 or 2 streets of value when you're out of position, but you're probably not going to do it very much. You're mostly going to bet here when you're out of position or in position with a very, very polarized range on the flop. So you're only betting your really awesome hands and your bluffs because nothing else really needs to be bet, with the exception of maybe some of this, middle stuff that could make high equity hands fold. Again, this isn't stuff you're going to be able to prove, so it's kind of like you're using theory to make your best guess at what you should do here, but all the theory you already know should make sense. So we've talked about it a lot. You should know what hands make sense to bet 1 or 2 streets for value with. All right, so the turn's just not going to be interesting. It's just going to be the exact same thing we've talked about. It doesn't matter what this turn card is. We know who has the polarized range because they bet on the flop. We know who has the condensed range because they called on the flop. We know what people's roles are. We know what each player's role is on the turn. Random, 5 of clubs, sure, doesn't matter. I mean, there's really nothing interesting to talk about here. Make sure your betting range is balanced. If you called on the flop, you're really rooting for your opponent to check that turn. And if you bet on the flop, when you bet the turn, your opponent should be indifferent to calling with almost all of his range, but you still can't bet too much or you're going to be too weighted towards bluffs, and he can exploit you by always calling with his bluff catchers. And when we talk about the hand like this, it probably makes it seem very, very simple, and it is probably one of the most, I would say, it is probably one of the easiest post-flop spots in poker, if I had to guess. But if you're recklessly betting here, if you're just betting because it's profitable without thinking, that's when you're going to find yourself going, oh, what do I do on the turn? What do I do with ace-9 after I bet the flop on the turn? Well, yeah, because you got yourself into that position by maybe betting a hand that shouldn't have been bet. So, make sure your flop play is good, and turn play will be a lot easier. Random. Okay, so ace-king-9. This is exactly like the ace-queen, I think it was 4 board. It's a little bit different because there's not even that much more coordination, because all this queen-jack, queen-10, jack-10 stuff was already gut shots. So this is kind of a good example of a spot where, yes, ace-king-9 is different than ace-queen-4 or whatever. And if you're super sick, you might think like, okay, well, it's different in all these different ways. You know, for example, ace-king hits less 2-pair in the button flatting range than ace-queen does, right? Ace-queen, people usually flatten the button against the cutoff open with all of their ace-queen combos. They're not flatting with all their ace-king. So it's definitely different in some relevant ways, and it will change bet sizing. But for the most part, these two, this board right here, ace-king-9 with a flush draw, and ace-queen-4 with a flush draw, are very, very similar. So if you've already spent time away from the tables working on one, you're not going to be that lost on what to do in the other one. So here, what would I say for this board texture right here? It's probably going to be very similar to the ace-queen-4. The only difference is, now, when we're in the cutoff, I'm not really that worried about my opponent having, my range is, let's actually just plug it in for... Alright, so I think the other one had 52% equity, so I would think this one has more, but I could be wrong. Okay, so 2% more equity than even the other one had. And more importantly, we're just not going to be beat all that often because the cutoffers button flat has 3.5% 2-pair instead of, I think it was 8%. So, when I say we're not going to be beat all that often, I mean when we have a really good hand. So, when we're in the cutoff shoes now, betting bigger makes more sense because we have all the really, really good hands, so we're probably not going to get raised that much. And betting more aggressively makes sense because on the flop, we have the really, really good hands in the cutoff, whereas our opponent in the button has more of the, it's almost like he already has a condensed range before you even bet because he just doesn't have that many premium hands. So that's different, but other than that, a lot of the stuff's going to be really similar. What kind of hands should we check call with here? Well, our aces and kings that didn't want to bet. We also should probably check call with some draws and stuff to balance out the rest of our, check calling range. You're even going to probably want to check raise here a bit. So, just like before, you could check raise some 4-5 and 4-6 suited and balance it with pocket fours. So, all this stuff is very similar. So, if you've already played with one board texture, you kind of already got a head start for the next one. So just don't get in the habit of, this is a good flop, I think, for the cutoff opening range because we have more equity and a better distribution of equity. But it's not like it's so awesome that we're going to bet our entire range on the flop. I mean, that would probably be terrible against someone that has 46% equity and the advantage of position. All right, so let's randomly generate a turn. Oops, see-daisy. I'm in too deep to edit that out. All right, so lock flop, right? Come on. All right, so the king of spades on the turn. So now, first question. Did this turn card change the strength of either player's range significantly? This is probably the first turn card we've gotten where we might say yes. Why is this turn card significant? Well, the person that bet on the flop probably didn't have all that many kings. Going back, what kind of kings are you betting on this flop? Whether you are in position or out of position, what kings are you betting? I would not be surprised if the answer is none, or if it's not none, it's probably close to none. When the turn card comes to king of spades, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So you're probably not betting many kings on this flop. What hands are you check calling with or calling a bet with in position? Sorry, what kings are you check calling with or calling a bet in position with? Probably almost all of them. So this is a very interesting turn card in the sense that it actually probably significantly strengthened the calling range on the turn. So the person that check called or called a bet in position on the flop is now going to have all these trips where the person that bet on the flop doesn't have all these trips. So this is actually what I would consider a rare turn card where donk betting might make sense. Because if I check call, imagine I'm playing against you. If I check call on this flop and the turn card comes the king of spades, I just got a lot of trips. So now maybe if I don't ever donk bet my trips, my checking range is too strong, and you go, whoa, I'm not going to bet here against Matt because I was mostly betting a bunch of aces on the flop, and I'm not going to bet them now because Matt has too many kings. So I don't want my checking range to be that awesome, because then you're just not going to bet, and I'm going to lose a bunch of value that I could have gotten. So I need to start donk betting with some of my kings, and I need to start donk betting bluffs. That goes back to how I've several times mentioned you need to call, with some gut shot. You need to check a call with some gut shots, with some flush draws. You need to check a call with some air that can be bluffed later on. If you're only check calling on this flop, like, let's look at this flop right here. If you're out of position, if you only check call on this flop with ace X and king X, that's what a lot of people do. If you only check a call with ace X and king X, that range is just, it's way too transparent. It's too easy for someone to exploit that. And that's how you know, okay, well, that can't be theoretically correct because I can easily exploit someone that check calls with that range. So then you figure out, okay, how do I balance this range? Well, one way you can do that is by check calling with some, gut shots, some flush draws, some hands that can be used as bluffs later on. Either if you get a turn card, you can donk bet, or if the opponent checks back the turn, you need to bluff the river. With the turn checking back and you bluffing the river being the much more likely outcome for why you need to check a call with some gut shots and stuff here. Okay, so you probably see how the king of spades is better for the person who called on the flop rather than the person who bet on the flop. And now you might be asking yourself, okay, so I see the king of spades is better. I get why donk betting makes sense. How do I determine how many hands I need to donk bet as a bluff? How do I determine, how big I should bet, all that kind of stuff? That's when you kind of got to go do the work for it. I've done a lot of work for flop stuff, which is why, as I was just saying earlier, I can see how this ace king 4 board is similar to the it was originally ace king 9, huh? I can see how this ace king 9 board is similar to the ace king or the ace queen 4 board because I've played around with a lot of flops and gotten used to what my ranges look like in the more common spots. This is a less common spot. When the turn card comes a king of spades, it changes things a lot. So this is a spot that I haven't really sat around with and played with much. So if I was playing and I got this king of spades turn, I'd think to myself, okay, maybe I should donk bet here. But honestly, I probably am not going to be that balanced because I just haven't practiced with it. I don't know exactly how much I should be bluffing here to be balanced. But to be honest, I would think to myself, you know what, I think I exploitatively can bluff here. Because I think if my opponent bet this flop, he's going to have, if I check to my opponent and he bets, he's going to, first of all, be bluffing a lot. Then a lot of times I'll also have, an ace that was value betting, like ace queen or ace jack. And then when the turn card comes a king and I lead by donk betting, he's going to think, what could Matt have possibly check called with that's not a king? People don't, he doesn't have air in his range, he can't donk bet, bluff, blah, blah, blah. So I think exploitatively bluffing bluffing here will be very effective on this ace king 9 board. But in terms of actually being balanced, probably not going to be as good as some other people are because I haven't played around with this spot. So, play around with the more common spots, get used to doing the obvious things, and then for something like this, the ace king 9, making sure you're betting sort of the right frequencies and sizings on the turn, that's sort of beyond the scope of probably any video I've done, and it would take me a long time to sort of fit around, sit down and sort of try to figure it out. But again, that stuff's much less important than getting the basics down. Way, 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 way less important because they occur way less frequently. And even if you just kind of have the basics down, you'll probably still do all right in spots. So, just something interesting to note. This is actually a very uncommon spot. All right, so let's keep going. So Jack 6-4, this is very similar to the one we just did, where we talked there's more coordination here, but I think we did like a Jack 5-2. So again, you're seeing the same thing, which is if you start doing these boards away from the table, you're going to be able to actually see a flop and be like, oh yeah, I've done one close to that before. And by done one, I mean you wrote out what you do with every hand in your range. You've seen. One thing that's very useful about this is you can look at your initial impressions and see how off they were. So for example, if you find out on this board texture, when you were originally check calling, let's say with only like queen jack and king jack, and that wasn't enough check calling hands, you can be like, oh, I see how hard it is to check call here. My opponents probably have this leak who haven't worked as hard on their game as I have. So that's something that's very useful to know. You really can learn a lot when you start randomly generating boards from remember your initial impressions even as you get better. So here, check raise the 6s and the 4s. You probably want to even check raise a little more aggro than that if you're having trouble check calling. If you can't check call very easily, you're going to need to check raise more aggressively. So if you find out you're struggling to check call here, go ahead and check raise some aces or something like that. check raising jacks might be a little less useful because of removal effects. We've already done a board that's close enough to this that I'm just going to randomly generate another one. Jack 10-3. That's a fun one. So this is going to literally be the 5th time I've tried to analyze this board texture. I've deleted all 4 previous recordings. It's very hard to discuss, and I'm not sure exactly what to do. Okay, so on this board texture, usually, as a general rule, if it's not that hard to check a call, it's not that bad to be out of position. There are exceptions. Here, the turn card and the river card are going to really change the strength of a lot of hands in each player's range. For example, if the turn card comes any diamond, any queen, any king, any ace, any 9, any 8, a bunch of hands that were weak became strong, and a bunch of hands that were strong became weak. That favors position significantly. When the turn and the river drastically change the strength of hands, that's another thing that really favors position. Usually that's tied very heavily with how difficult it is to check a call. Now, here, even though the cutoff range has more equity, it's still very difficult to bet on this flop texture. The reason for that is the player in position has an overpair or better 6.62% of the time, so any of these hands can be raised for value, as well as a whole bucket full of bluffs, and then a lot of draws that retain their equity very well. You know, the standard draws that are kind of like a value raise, but not as good as a made hand. It's like, you know, 9-8 of diamonds, for example, you can raise in position here. So, when you bet out of position here, the player in position is going to go, okay, well, I don't want to give a bunch of free cards when I have all these strong hands, so I'm going to raise very, very aggressively to make it difficult for the cutoff when he bets out of position to realize the equity of his king, queen, his ace, queen, his ace, his king, queen, his, oh, that's the wrong range, his ace, king, his ace, queen, and his king, queen, and all that kind of stuff. So, when you're out of position here, usually I would still justify a bet with a hand like queens by saying, well, when I bet queens, I make high equity hands fold. So even if it kind of sucks when I get raised, it might be worth it. The problem here is if you bet queens, what high equity hands do you make fold? Look at the button flatting range. Any hands that queens can get outdrawn by, like queen king or ace queen or ace king, those hands aren't going to fold to a flop bet. Flush draws aren't going to fold to a flop bet. So the only hands that you're really making fold are going to be like ace 9 or ace 8 that weren't really all that likely to outdraw queens anyways. Likewise, we'll make hands like 8, 7, 6s, and 5s fold. Those hands weren't going to outdraw queens anyways. So a hand like queens is kind of hard to justify betting, in my opinion, because it's going to get raised all the time, and getting raised with queens completely sucks, but when the opponent calls, it's not all that awesome. It is awesome when you bet queens, though, and your opponent calls and the turn card comes a blank, which further complicates things. But that doesn't happen at a super high frequency, and it's also awesome when we check queens on the flop, our opponent checks back, and the turn card comes a blank. Because then we can start overbetting on the turn, because we know queens aren't going to be beat, and our opponent's going to have check back the flop with like a lot of jack X and 10X. Okay. So, when we're out of position, I'm leaning towards the benefits. At a glance, I think the disadvantages of betting queens, kings, and aces outweighs the benefits, because we don't really make high equity hands fold, and it sucks when we get raised. But if we never bet on this flop, and it's kind of going to be hard to bet hands like pocket 10s and pocket 4s, because those hands usually you need to check raise. Those hands protect our checking range usually by check raising. If we never are betting on this flop, though, our checking range might get too weak. So if I check to you, and you know that I'm never checking any, if you know that I'm never betting any of my strong hands, you might respond by not betting very aggressively, because you think, well, why should you bet aggressively when I'm going to check raise you so much, or I'm going to check call you so much? So, in that case, it requires us to bet sometimes on this flop, because if we bet sometimes, then our checking range will overall be weaker. Usually our betting range is stronger than our checking range, of course. So if I start betting this flop maybe, let's say, 15% of the time, that might make my checking range weak enough, so now I'm indifferent to betting and checking with an overpair. So, yeah, it's very difficult to tell what to do here. And I get what I'm thinking, but it's very hard for me to tell if I'm expressing this clearly, even though, as I said, I've tried 4 times already. But at the end of the day, I don't want to bet here because getting raised sucks so much, but I also don't want to check with such a strong range that my opponent's going to almost always check back, because if he does, then I'm going to get less value from checking with strong hands than I would have with betting. So I have to make an equilibrium somewhere by checking and betting at the right frequency, but I don't think I'm going to bet at a very high frequency. Okay, let's randomly generate a turn. 7 of spades. So that's kind of in between being a blank and getting there, because 8-9 suited got there, but overall, relatively a blank turn card. So I imagine if I bet this flop and got called, I would want to have an overbetting range. If this flop checked through and I was out of position, I would want to have an overbetting range. It's much easier for me to represent a strong hand. Like, I could have been check folding on the flop with pocket sevens. I could have been checking, with pocket queens or whatever, or pocket aces, and I can start betting big. It doesn't necessarily have to be a massive overbet, but I can start betting big on the turn because I don't think I'm going to be beat when my opponent checks back. If you check back in position on a board like this, then you're going to have a much harder time, overbetting the turn, because it's like, well, what would you have checked back with that was strong? Obviously you can check with pocket tens planning to check raise on the flop, but you can't really check back pocket tens on the flop. That wouldn't make sense. So overall, this is kind of a blank turn. Let's do another random turn. Another blank, same deal. Another blank, same deal. Really? Really? Okay, so that's less of a blank. So then when you get a card like this just done changed the whole game. So then you have to really almost rethink everything again. So, in the other hand examples we were doing, we were kind of just like, same deal on the turn. 1% is a polarized range, 1% is a condensed range, no big deal. We kind of already know the answer even before we start talking about it. Here, you're really going to have to look at the flop action and then figure out everything else again. Can someone represent 16 combos of king-queen and the other represent none? Well, in that case, the person that can't have king-queen is probably pretty screwed. And that might be okay. Because it might just be like, before, the person that called with no king-queen didn't know the turn was going to come in ace. So the caller might have just said to himself, honestly, if the turn card comes in ace, I'm pretty screwed. That could be okay, or maybe he has to call with some king-queen to make that work, but still doesn't have very many. So when you get a turn card on this board texture, we happen to get 4 blanks in a row, which is kind of nuts. But usually, okay, so that one's crazy. But usually it'll mix it up quite a bit. And then you're going to have to really just reevaluate everything, and it's going to be like the same way on that flop where I had to really think, what does each person's range look like? How do we try to make an equilibrium? And I wasn't even really sure. You're going to have to do the same thing on the turn. Very, very tough board to analyze. Really, really hard. Alright, so this is my second go at this one. We're getting all the hard board textures at once, apparently. So this board texture, the first thing that strikes me is it's going to be very hard to check a call when you're out of position on this board. And the reason for that is it's just very risky giving free cards. But the same boards that are difficult to check a call on are also the boards where the opponent doesn't like giving free cards. So, if we're out of position here, and I'm guessing most people that watch these videos are probably usually betting on these boards because check calling is just hard and people don't like to take harder lines. So, people bet on these boards and they justify it by saying, I don't want to give a bunch of free cards. Okay, I get that. But the person in position also is going to say, I don't want to give a bunch of free cards if we check to him. That makes check raising more effective than it would otherwise be, especially in contexts where we have trouble check calling and we need to defend some checks, so this encourages us to check raise really aggressively here. So if we are in the cutoff here, I would really recommend probably check raising all of the sets and a bunch of bluffs, because otherwise it's just we're not going to be defending our checks aggressively enough to prevent our opponent from betting really, really aggro. You're still going to probably have to check a call with some hands here that aren't awesome to check call with. Like, you can check call with pocket 8s, you can check call with pocket 7s, you can check call with 9-8s, you can check call with some king 10, some ace 10, you can check call with some ace 9, some king 9. You can check call with some queen 10, some jack 10. King 10 and ace 10, maybe those are a little bit more likely to bet. And even with hands like queen 10, jack 10, and queen 9, there's reasonable arguments for betting them on the flop and then check calling on the turn, because you might make high equity hands fold here. For example, let's say queen 10. Queen 10 might make ace jack fold, which has a lot of equity against queen 10. That encourages us to bet it. So it's a very tough board to analyze, but what you really want to think of when you're betting here is, if I'm betting with a vulnerable hand here, am I actually making high equity hands fold? Here, you're probably much more likely to be doing that than in the last example where you really weren't when you bet queens on the jack 10 4 board. Here, when you bet queen 10, you're more likely to make a hand like ace jack fold, which is nice. Or if you bet jack 10, you're more likely to make king queen's not going to fold. So you got to really think ahead to what hands will fold. So yeah, check raise very aggressively here because you're just going to have trouble check calling super as aggressively as you'd like. When we bet on a board like this, we're going to bet sort of enough hands that our checking range isn't too strong. So the same kind of mix of mostly over pairs. You maybe could bet like a few straights that aren't check, maybe you want to check call with some pocket tens or straights. But you could bet with some over pairs, a few really strong hands, and then enough bluffs to balance it as well. And then in position. This is a board where if I'm in position against most unknowns, I would probably just bet everything because I don't want to give free cards. But against someone that's playing really, really well, a closer to optimal opponent, you can't recklessly bet here in a position because the out of position player should be check raising aggressively. So here, if you're playing against an unknown, yeah, go ahead and recklessly bet any two if you think it's going to be most effective. But against someone that's actually defending their checks, that's not going to be a very good strategy. You're going to have to check back a lot of, medium strength hands and stuff like that. So really think about boards like this because it's a board where, let's say you have pocket nines here in the cutoff. I feel like if I were to tell someone, I would check raise this flop, they'll go, wait a second, I don't want to give free cards. And I would say, yeah, but your opponent doesn't want to give free cards either. So in reality, your check raise is going to succeed here a lot. And that's especially true if your opponent has like a straight draw. So if you check here with pocket nines and the opponent has like king jack or queen king or queen jack or like, maybe he'll check some of the 8s or 7s, but those hands, the ones that I just mentioned, he's probably going to bet like all of them. He's going to be like, oh, cool, I have overcards and I have a gutter or open in a straight draw. He's going to bet. So the hands that 9s are sort of really vulnerable against, you're going to succeed with your check raise most of the time. So yeah, check raise this board aggressively. When you're out of position, in position, don't bet that recklessly. If your opponent's good, if he's not, go ahead and emphasize betting. Alright, let's randomly generate a turn. Boop. So, dry turn card. So everyone that's been watching this video should probably know like the significance of that. If the board is, if the turn's a blank, then you really expect the bettor to still have the polarized range and is going to be betting very aggressively and likely betting big. Whereas the calling range is going to just pretty much always be checking and is just going to be mostly holding bluff catchers. Because even if you check call in this board texture, you might be able to check call some really, really strong hands, but still it's probably going to be mostly medium strength hands. And same deal, out of position, maybe even check call with the ace-king here and stuff like that before. We didn't even mention that, but we talked about check calling with the ace-king earlier. It could still be correct here. Let's randomly generate another turn. Can I just hit random? Cool. So 4, blank, not blank. You got to sort of redo stuff when this happens and kind of figure out, okay, who can have the queen jack? That's going to be most important. Who can have more queen jack? Who can have more pocket 7s? How does that affect sizing? How does that affect each player's range? That stuff's tough. And you're really going to have to spend a lot of time getting that to sort of click because there's just a lot more different turn combinations than there are flop combinations. So, oops. Oh, I guess we're on to our next flop. Jack 4-2. So this one is not that hard to check a call when you're out of position. There's just not all that much coordination. Again, you can check a call with the ace-king and the ace-queen as is necessary. You can check a call with a lot of jacks. Some middle pairs can probably go either way. Again, there's a lot of advantages to betting something like 9s. You make king 10 and stuff fold. We've already talked a lot about that. But even king 10 might not always fold here if it's 3 to a flush, which it usually will be. So take that into account. But yeah, pretty standard board. Nothing too special about it. You're still going to want to check raise like pocket 4s and pocket 2s when you're out of position here. Maybe you don't need to check raise all of them, but my guess is you still probably do. And then you're going to want to be value betting primarily over pairs and like ace-jack and the right amount of bluffs. And then when you're in position and your opponent checks you, you're going to pretty much do the same thing. You're going to bet like ace-jack and better, your sets. And then you're going to check, you can bet some of the medium strength hands for one sheet of value and a whole bunch of bluffs. And then you're going to check back like king-jack and queen-jack and all that kind of fun stuff. So let's randomly do a turn. Boop. And so this turn card was going to be dry no matter what. And what's important to note about this is if the turn card was going to be if the turn card wasn't really going to change things no matter what, then you expect the person who's in position to just call with his sets on the flop. So right here, when we bet the flop, our opponent's going to just kind of call with his sets. So that means even though the turn card is blank, the opponent's range is not going to be as condensed. It will still have all those really awesome hands in his range because he just didn't need to raise them. If we bet the flop and he has pocket 4s, he's going to go, cool, I'm just going to call and then raise the turn, because that's more effective since it now puts us in bad shape when we double barrel our diamonds, or, I mean, the gutter's not that bad, but yeah, it'll still make stuff, make us have to fold gut shots and stuff like that, which isn't that fun. So just be aware of that. If the board's super dry and we bet and our opponent calls, we're not going to want to overbet the turn. Our opponent's still going to raise us quite a bit, and that's going to make our life tough when we have draws. And that's just another good example of why position's still good, even if it's like this. I mean, this This board is not that bad to be out of position, but it's still going to suck on a lot of turn cards when we get that turn. Our opponent raises, and we're like, ugh, we have a draw. The jack is about as dry as they come. Still, we'll have the same problem when the flush card comes. We can bet and get raised, but yeah, the jack's really dry. Same deal with the queen. The queen changes things a little bit more because now, if we were, who had ace-queen in his range and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, any turn card will be dry, and what I said for the 6 of diamonds will apply on that turn. So just something to know. All right, so that pretty much wraps it up. I know it's only an hour of footage, but I assure you I did more and had to re-edit it. Although I didn't get rid of the tough board textures, we still did those, which is why they ended up taking forever. So don't worry that I'm just editing out all the hard flops, because I'm not. So I hope you enjoyed the video. It was interesting talking about the turn sum. I'll probably do another video or two about it. But, yeah, if you play the flop well, the turn's usually not all that hard. And then the sort of tricky turn spots that do come, they occur less frequently. So if you're at that skill level where you need to start working on that aspect of your game, by all means, go for it. But get the flop down first, because that's much more important and occurs much more frequently, and it will make the turn easier to play. Once the flop's done, then start really analyzing your turn play to make sure everything is working out. So, hope you enjoyed the video. I'll look forward to reading your comments. Good luck, guys. Bye.